talk, we're going to be zooming in on Chinese coercion. So let's take a look at a data set that I've collected about Chinese coercion from 1990 to 2020. The gray bars that you see here are cases of Chinese coercion, and by coercion, I mean the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the trustee. So you can see that over the past 3 decades, an increase of Chinese coercive action. But it's might think that, well, it's no brainer, right? China's power has grown over the years, and it's not surprising that we're seeing this uptick trend. But what's more interesting to me is when we take a look at the tools of China's coercion. So same figure, but broken down into different kinds of coercive tools, with the orange bars being non-military coercion and blue bars military coercion. And we can see that in the 1990s, China used military coercion about half the time. An example would be the missile testing over the Taiwan Strait. Beginning in 2000s, we're seeing an increase of frequency of Chinese coercion, but what's also interesting is that China has been utilizing non-military coercion overwhelmingly in lieu of military coercion. An example would be the banana bans that China imposed against the Philippines over maritime disputes in the South China Sea. And another example would be the use of frozen coercion against Vietnam, also over maritime disputes in the South China Sea. So there is variation over the tools of Chinese coercion. And another aspect of Chinese coercion that also would be about the targets. Now, let's stick with this South China Sea theme and take a look at an internal map that I got from the Chinese Academy of Sciences when I was doing field work a couple of years back. The whitish area in the middle that you see here is the South China Sea, and the black dashed line that you see here is China's dashed line. And essentially, China claims all of the land features as well as maritime rights from within the dashed line. Towards the bottom, you're going to see some orange dots, and these are Malaysian oil fields, and there are a lot of them within the Chinese dashed line. And to your right, you're going to see one single purple dot, which is the Philippine oil field. So there's only one within the dashed line. Now, the question for you, by raise of hands, is that of these 2 countries, which would China be coercing more harshly and frequently? Team Malaysia here, anyone? Really? Team Philippines? Wow, and the rest, abstain? Which is very much aligned with China's voting record at the UN. Are wondering. Well, so I think the majority of you are much smarter than I am. So the winner is Team Philippines. China coerces the Philippines a lot more harshly and frequently than it does with regard to Malaysia. But if you were me, I was Team Malaysia when I was looking at this map initially because of how many Malaysia has within the dashed line. But I was wrong. So the variation over tools and targets of China's coercion led me to answer this central question of what, which is when, why, and how does China coerce when faced with perceived threats to its national security. In the book, I offer the cost balancing theory to explain China's coercion, placing China's coercion in an era of global economic panics. And argue first that China coerces one target state in order to deter other states from doing similar things that it does not like in the future. And second, I would argue that coercion is more likely when the need to establish a reputation for resolve is high, but the economic cost of coercing the target takes low. And finally, and by the need to establish resolve reputation, that I mean concerns about appearing weak vis-a-vis other states if no coercive action is enough. And finally, I would argue that China prefers to use non-militarized coercive tools when the geopolitical backlash is high. And by geopolitical backlash, I mean concerns about the dispute escalating into a militarized confrontation if military coercion is used. And this oftentimes leads China to adopt Goldilocks choices. That is, using coercion, but for fear of escalation, it kept it at the non-militarized level. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to first talk about the theoretical and empirical contributions of the book, relatively, and then move on to defining the concept of coercion as they like the roadmap industry and the research is on. And then talk about some empirical case studies in the South China Sea, the article that you write, and finally studies that continue to talk about the coalition. So the topic of this book is coercion. And there's a vast literature on coercion. But the coercion literature tends to focus on evaluating the effectiveness of coercion once a decision to coerce has. And for those scholars that do study coercion decisions, some of them emphasize the role of domestic politics. But it still remains to be seen whether this can be applicable to China. And finally, there is this portion of the coercion literature that prioritizes military coercion, arguing that you either go big or go small, and arguing that military coercion maximizes the expected utility of use of coercion. But it's still puzzling to see China utilizing those non-militarized coercive tools if they are considered simple. So the book theorizes coercion by answering two questions. First, when and why China coerces, and second, what lives more or less likely is like. And the book also speaks to theories on rising powers. So traditional literature on rising powers, including the power transition literature, for example, tends to answer the big picture questions of war and peace. So this book is more so in line with the burgeoning literature on rising powers that examines the specific foreign policy behavior of a rising power while it is still in the policy, right? So think about some of the work that Josh Stephenson, for example, at the University of Maryland has done. And incredibly, this book provides a first systematic analysis of China's approach to coercion, as well as a data set on coercion of both. And hopefully, by understanding China's coercion rationale more, it'll help us better understand China's national security decision-making process. Now that we've talked about the sort of theoretical backgrounds, let's get to the concept of coercion a little bit more. So I define coercion as the use or threats of negative actions to demand a change in the behavior of the target state. And for those of you who have read Tom Shelley, you might know and remember that coercion includes both compounds and deterrence. But for the book, coercion here includes just compounds. And there's a full spectrum of coercive tools that states, including China, can utilize. So there are several of them. And the first kind is diplomatic sanctions. An example could be canceling senior level meetings or more extremely cutting ties completely. And the second kind of tool can be economic sanctions. The banana ban that I introduced would be an example, but more extremely, one can impose a total embargo on such. So what straddles these strictly non-military and military coercion is what I call gray zone coercion. So gray zone coercion is the use or threats of civilian law enforcement organizations to inflict physical damage on the target state. So think about China's use of its maritime surveillance ships, the predecessor to the Chinese Coast Guard ships, as well as the Coast Guard ships in the South Sea. And finally, states can escalate into military coercion, and the missile catching, of course, will be as an example. Now that we've talked about the concept, let me get to the theory a little bit more in detail so that you get to understand what is the logic. The cause-and-effect theory answers two questions. First, when and why China coerces, and second, what tools is more or less likely to utilize. Let's get to the one question first. The underlying assumption of this book is that in an era of global economic interdependence, coercion decisions are a result of balancing securities and economic factors. So on the one hand, states care about external security. And if we follow the logic of the literature on reputation resulting in signaling, then China might feel the need and pressure to use coercion in order to demonstrate to the other states that it is resolved and committed to defend its national security interests. And China might fear that if no coercive action is used, then other states might interpret this inaction as unresolved need. So this might call for the use of coercion. But on the other hand, coercion does carry with it costs. And I would argue that the primary cost would be economic. And if we follow the logic of the literature on economic interdependence, commercial peace, and more recently weaponized interdependence, then because China is an economically integrated state and is part of the global production and supply chains, then it has to think about the potential negative economic consequences of using coercion of any kind. And therefore, coercion decisions can be visualized in a decision tree. So first off, China would need to decide the level of the need to establish a reputation for resolve. And if the need is low, we're more likely to see China refraining from coercion. But when the need to establish resolve is high, China would need to consider the economic cost of using coercion. And when the economic cost is low, we're more likely to see China using coercion. Now, you might wonder, what about the circumstances when the need to establish resolve and economic cost are both high? So I argue that that's when the issue importance variable comes into play. So issue importance is the stakes that states attach to certain issues. And empirically, in the case of China, there's a very strictly defined interest hierarchy, with Taiwan and Tibet, for example, being the core interests, and Taiwan being the core of the core interests. And other issues, such as maritime disputes, the rocks that I'm very much personally interested in, they're important, but they're not individually at the level of core interests. So I argue that it's only when the issue importance variable is the highest that we're more likely to see China using coercion, and when the issue importance is lower, China's more likely to refrain from coercion when the need to establish resolve and economic costs are both high. So in the book, I examine, in particular in the Taiwan chapter, the role of the issue importance variable, but for the talk, we're going to be zooming in on circumstances when the two variables are not high. Now, let's get to the second part of the question, which is about the tools of China's coercion. And here, I would argue that the primary variable is the geopolitical backlash cost. And by geopolitical backlash, I follow the logic of balance of threat literature. So if China is aware that other states might be balancing against itself by either forming or strengthening alliances with external great powers, for example, the United States, then it has to take into consideration the potential that a militarized coercion might escalate the dispute with the target state into a militarized confrontation, especially if the target state has mutual defense treaties with external powers. So if China does not want a militarized confrontation, then when the geopolitical backlash cost is high, it's more likely to use non-military coercion. But when the geopolitical backlash cost is low, it has more room for maneuver to use military coercion. So this concludes my discussion of the theory itself. Now let's transition to the research design to see how I test the cost balancing theory. And essentially in the book, I adopt two qualitative methods. And the first one is congruence testing, which I'll illustrate later. And the second one is process tracing with case studies and sometimes with the most similar case research design method. And the empirical section will illustrate these methods a little bit more in detail. And in terms of issue areas, of course, I cover South China Sea disputes as well as issues in the East China Sea and issues over Taiwan and Tibet in a separate article over Sino-Indian land border dispute. But for the talk, we're going to be zooming in on the South China Sea. Now, you might be wondering, what about some of the sources that you utilize for the book? Well, here we go. I don't know, 50 pounds of books that I hauled from China after a trip to China in spring 2023. And on top of it, if you can just wait a little bit, would be a red study notebook for the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Party Congress. And of course, I'm kidding, I didn't use any of these books for the book on coercion, but I am utilizing them for the second book on China's grant strategy. But I am utilizing primary Chinese language sources of several kinds. So I'll introduce them first. And when we get to the measurement section, I'm also going to introduce some of the objective indicators that I also utilize to cross-check with the primary Chinese language sources. So the first kind of a Chinese language source I use would be official sources. On the left-hand side, for example, so these are government documents, would be a book entitled China's Foreign Affairs, published by the Chinese Foreign Ministry annually, going all the way back to 1987. And on the right-hand side would be a secret document internally circulated at the Chinese Communist Party's Central International Liaison Department. But I did not steal this document from China. It's actually available at the Gambit Library at George Washington University, which has a really fabulous China documentation center for those interested. And the second kind of tool I utilize would be semi-official sources, including government think tank reports. So on the left-hand side, for example, would be an internal report from the Chinese National Institute for South China Sea Studies, which is under the Foreign Ministry, as well as the State Council. And on the right-hand side, for example, would be some internal analysis from the Chinese Navy. And I was able to get access to some of these internal sources when I was doing field work in China in the pre-COVID period. And finally, I was able to conduct some interviews when I was doing field work in China. And again, pre-COVID, I've done about 150 interviews or so. and about 45% of them work with Chinese government analysts, and about a quarter work with former civilian officials, and 6% were with former military officials, and the last quarter were with well-connected Chinese scholars who sometimes brief central leaders, including And these interviews are useful for me for two purposes. So first, I use these interviews as well as other sources to cross-check and triangulate. And second, some of these interviewees contain rich information about the case studies I'm interested in. So let me just give you one example. I got to interview the captain of one Chinese maritime surveillance ship, and this captain was the person that drove the ship into the disputed waters between China and Japan in the East China Sea. And I was able to gain invaluable information from just one interview. And that's an example of me doing interviews many moons ago. It was still easy to get access to some of these interviews. So now that we've talked about the primary Chinese language sources, let's get to the measurement section a little bit more in detail so that you know how I measure the variables in the cosmetics here. The variables of interest here are three. And the first one is the need to establish result. And the second is the economic cost of coercing the target state. And third, geopolitical backlash cost. So in the book, I adopted a binary encoding scheme that is treating them as either high or low, although it's acknowledged that in reality, things would be a lot more complicated. But for theoretical simplicity, I do keep the binary encoding, but the empirical chapters do reflect a little bit more on nuance. So let's get to the need to establish result first. And I use both objective indicators as well as primary speech evidence or primary Chinese language sources to cross-check and triangulate. And there are two kinds of objective indicators. And the first one would be the number of challenges from other states. By challenges, I mean the things that the other states did that China considers as threatening to its national security. And a related objective indicator is the level of international media exposure of these challenges themselves. So the logic here is that if China is seeing an increase of these challenges from others, and if these challenges themselves are heavily reported through international media, such as AP or AFP or Reuters, then other states might all be observing these incidents and China's reaction or lack thereof. So China's fear is that if it does not take course of action in response, that other states might interpret this inaction as unresolved and weak. And I'll also cross-check with speech evidence to see if Chinese officials and analysts were expressing concerns about appearing weak vis-a-vis other states. And moving then to economic cost. And I use, again, objective stats as well as speech evidence to cross-check. And in terms of the econ stats, I examine whether the target state is a major export market for China, or whether the target state is a critical component in China's supply chains. For example, providing China with a high-tech intermediate product or high technologies, things that China needs but cannot produce itself, or whether the target state is a critical energy supplier to China, or finally, whether the target state is a critical official development assistance supplier, ODA supplier, which is especially crucial for China in the 1990s and early 2000s. So here we're really talking about Hirschman's model of, say, exit options for left neural. How difficult it is for China to have these sorts of exit options. And of course, also cross-check with speech evidence to see how Chinese officials view these foreign trade relations with other states, right? So if China depends more so on the target state than vice versa, then the economic cost will be high. And finally, onto geopolitical backlash cost. And here I use two indicators. And the first one will be general balancing backlash, in which I track to what extent, for example, external great powers such as the United States is strengthening or forming alliances with the target state. So this is more about long-term concerns about balancing. And I also cross-check with immediate war escalation risk, in which I track the likelihood of the United States getting militarily involved in a dispute between the target state and China. So if the immediate war escalation risk is high, the geopolitical backlash cost for China to use military coercion is also high. And these two indicators tend to go hand in hand as well. So now that we've finished the very boring theoretical stuff, and hopefully here comes to the slightly more interesting stuff about the actual series. And like I said earlier, we're going to be zooming in on the South China Sea. So let's take a look at figure 2, which tracks challenges from other disputes from the South China Sea in the South China Sea from 1990 to 2020. The blue bars here that you see here are coded as incidents, by which I mean actions taken by the other South China Sea disputants. And it's important to note here that these actions are not necessarily actions that tilt the military balance of power to China's disadvantage. Oftentimes, these are actions that are taken by other disputants in order to strengthen their own administrative control on their sovereignty and maritime rights within the South China Sea. And China views these actions as diminishing China's own sovereignty claims as well as maritime rights within Southeast Asia. So let me give you some concrete examples. In the 1990s, you're seeing a little bit like an increase, a bump here in between 1993 to 95 or so. These tend to include actions such as Vietnam occupying a new land feature in the South China Sea. And in between 2000 and 2005 or so, you're seeing a slight decrease here. And these tend to include actions that are a little more demure and much less dramatic and compared to the 1990s. An example would be a Malaysian politician landing on a land feature that it has already occupied since the 1990s. And beginning 2006 or 7 or so, we're seeing sort of an increase again here. And these tend to include actions such as the Philippines signing an oil and gas contract with foreign companies in the South China Sea. So this is the same figure, but I added China's coercion in response to some of these incidents in red. So we can see that in the 1990s, China used military used coercion, sometimes selectively, not responding to every single incident. And some of the 1990s cases of China's coercion were actually militarized in the South China Sea. And in between 2000 and 2006 or so, China refrained from coercion. And beginning 2007, we're seeing China using coercion again, and again, selectively not responding to every single incident. And none of the post-2007 cases of China's coercion were militarized. So in the book, I conducted Congress testing to demonstrate that temporal changes and variation in China's patterns of coercion track with temporal changes and variation in the independent variables of the confidence theory, the ones that we talked about before. But for the talk, if we have time, we're going to talk about a paired comparison of two cases. With the first one being the 2012 Scarborough Shoal incident between China and the Philippines, where China used coercion. But interestingly, that same incident took place in 2001, with the only difference being China refrained from coercion in that case. So let's get to the 2012 Scarborough Shoal case very briefly to give you a flavor of some of the terms that I have in the book. So Scarborough Shoal is a little red down here in the South China Sea. And in April, China tried to, in April 2012, Chinese fishermen tried to fish in the disputed waters around the Scarborough Shoal, and they were arrested by Filipino Navy personnel. And China used coercive actions of three kinds, none of which militarized. And the first kind would be the use of gray zone coercion. So China's maritime surveillance ships, the predecessor to the Coast Guard ships, blockaded Philippine Navy vessels from entry into the shoal, leading to a standoff. And China also imposed the banana ban for a kind of economic sanctions. And finally, China also imposed diplomatic sanctions by canceling senior-level meetings between Chinese leaders and the Filipino counterparts. So the goals of China's coercion in this case were twofold. Directly, it wants to force the Philippines to withdraw, but more broadly, also wants to enforce a policy of restraint on all South China Sea disputes. So through process tracing, I was able to show that the need to establish resolve was high in this case, but the economic cost of coercion in the Philippines was low, and therefore China used coercion. Now let's get first to the need to establish resolve, which is coded as high in this case because of these objective stats as well as primary speech evidence. So if we look at the objective stats, there was prior to China's use of coercion an increase of actions taken by the Philippines, as well as other South China Sea disputes. And interestingly, these actions themselves were heavily reported through international media. And this actually includes the Scarborough Shoal incident itself. So this is a photo taken by the Philippine Navy, and the gentleman you see up front, those were the Chinese fishermen, and the gentleman in the back was the Philippine Navy personnel. And this photo was released to AFD prior to China using coercion. There was a high exposure of these incidents that China considers as threatening. And in addition, if we look at speech evidence, the logic of using coercion to establish resolve is pretty clear here. So, for example, this is one piece of semi-official source from Zhongsheng at People's Daily, the Communist Party's party paper, in February 2012, that noted that if the Philippines tries to push for cooperation as a sign of weakness and continue to encroach upon China's legitimate rights, the Philippines is the wrong purpose. And guess what? The Philippines did seem to have the wrong calculus. China used coercion, and in the middle of the coercive action, the same source from People's Daily noted again that the Philippines should not view China as weak, and China could create a Scarborough model to stop the opponent and to deter future Chinese radicals. So the use of coercion to establish resolve in the future is pretty clear here. And note also that these pieces of evidence took place before and during China's coercion, so it's not post-hoc justification of China's coercion behavior. And finally, I was able to interview some former senior state oceanic administration officials, those who were in charge of the Scarborough incident, and former military officers and diplomats. So the consensus among them is that China feared being viewed as weak by other states, which might in turn give the green light for other states to take actions in the future. So these interviewees posed this ancient Chinese proverb to describe their logic, which is killing the chicken to scare the monkey, with the Philippines being the chicken and other South China citizens being the monkey. But if I were to paraphrase, I think it's more accurate to translate it as scaring the chickens in order to scare other monkeys. But please don't ask me the relationship between the chickens and the monkeys. I don't know why they're related. They're just analogies from the zoo. So the need to establish resolve was coded as high in this case. But in contrast, the economic cost of coercion the target state, which is the Philippines, was low. So if we look at figure 3, which tracks Sino-Philippine trade as a total share of Chinese foreign trade from 1993 to 2014, the blue line here is China's imports from the Philippines, red line, imports from the Philippines, and blue line, exports to the Philippines. You can see that Sino-Philippine trade constituted as a very small amount of overall Chinese foreign trade. At best, maybe about 2.5% or so, but most of the time it stays below 1%. And in contrast, Chinese officials knew, and well before coercion, the Sino-Philippine trade was highly asymmetrical to China's advantage. And in particular, by 2011, China had become the Philippines' third largest trading partner. And in 2012, Sino-Philippine trade constituted about 30% of overall Philippine trade, but only 0.9% for China. So Chinese officials stated explicitly, including those from the Chinese Ministry of Commerce, that prior to coercion, that China could impose sanctions on the Philippines and isolate the Philippines, and while strengthening economic relations with other ASEAN countries. For example, they can buy more bananas from Thailand. So as a result, China used coercion in this case. But remember, I mentioned earlier that none of the 3 kinds of coercive tools that China used in this case were militarized. And I argue that that's because of the high geopolitical backlash cost. And if anything, I should also add that the geopolitical backlash cost for China to use military coercion in some China Sea has been high since the early 2000s. So if we track the AU versions of the Chinese Foreign Ministry's book, the one that I showed earlier, there has been an increased concern about increased U.S. efforts in Southeast Asia, ironically, right after 9/11. So the logic of the Chinese Foreign Ministry is that because of counterterrorism, Southeast Asia has become an important stronghold for the United States, noting in particular that Bush Jr. designated the Philippines as a major non-NATO ally. And this, in fact, is actually cross-checked with U.S. national security strategy documents, because 2001 was the very first time that East Asia, including Southeast Asia, was listed as a vital interest. And this is very much in line with some of the work that Nina Selak has done, in which she argues that the United States pivoted back to Asia before the Obama period. It actually started in the Bush Jr. period. Right. In addition, if we look at the geopolitical backlash cost in the 2012 case itself, is also quoted as high. And I've done some interviews with former Navy colonels, and they were very much concerned about using military coercion because the U.S. Navy, in their logic, might directly militarily involved. And this is very much in line with some of this interviews that I've done with civilian diplomats. And finally, there were internal assessments from the Chinese Foreign Ministry affiliated analysts prior to the 2012 incident that suggested that as long, and I quote, as Chinese coercion was controlled and non-militarized, the United States would not get militarily involved. So here the Goldilocks logic is pretty clear. Here China used reasonable coercion for plausible deniability. Now, some of you might remember the other case, 2001, in which case the exact same incident took place. Chinese fishermen were arrested by Philippine Navy personnel, but China refrained from coercion that case. So very briefly, I would argue that the reason has to do with the low need to establish resolve in 2001. Because if we look at behavioral indicators, Philippines actions were way more demure and much less frequent in the early 2000s, which is very much in line with the little dip that you see in figure 2. And these actions themselves were not reported as heavily by international media as compared to, say, 2012 period. And if we look at primary speech evidence, there was a memoir written by former Deputy Chinese Foreign Minister Ying, who was then Chinese ambassador to the Philippines at the time. And she wrote about this incident in her memoir, recalling that the Philippines' actions differed in the early 2000s, in particular noting the Philippines to be a lot more cooperative than compared to the post-2010 period. And that's why I argue that China refrained from coercion in this case. And finally, very briefly, since I'm running out of time, some of you might still be angry about why Team Malaysia lost, because I certainly was. So let me explain very briefly here why China did not coerce Malaysia as much as it does with regard to the Philippines. The reason, again, has to do with the differential need to establish resolve, which was high with regard to the Philippines, but low, vis-a-vis relatively lower with regard to Malaysia. So the logic here is that, and again, from a lot of the interviewees, is that the Philippines is the loudest in internationalizing or sensationalizing the South China Sea issue, whereas for them, Malaysia is the smart one because it is silently making profits off of the South China Sea without internationalizing or sensationalizing the issue. So they're concerned, and if you look at media exposure on the part of Malaysia versus the Philippines media exposure was way higher than compared to Malaysia. So their concern is that the Philippines publicizes all of this oil and gets contracts, even though it does not really have an operating oil field within the NDISC line. But if China does not use coercion on those, then other states might imitate the Philippines' behavior, including foreign companies in future, and therefore China coerces the Philippines a lot more. And of course, in the book, I do consider other potential scenarios or explanations, such as the role of individual leaders or bureaucratic politics or interests, and the role of nationalism, and finally offensive realism, because everybody likes, John much more so than me. I'm more than happy to talk about any of these in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I'll just skip over them now and go straight to the conclusions. So to conclude, the book examines when, why, and how China uses coercion, and I argue that China oftentimes makes Goldilocks choices, balancing between the need to establish resolve and the economic cost of using coercion, as well as taking into consideration the potential geopolitical backlash. And this suggests that economic interdependence and a globalized economy provides both opportunities and constraints for rising powers, including China's coercive action. And this is very much in line with some of my ongoing work on China's preferences for forming strategic partnerships as opposed to formal alliances. And secondly, in the book in particular, coercion has oftentimes been used by China as a signaling device. In particular, China demonstrates this interesting dynamic of compelling to deter, blurring the lines between compellence and deterrence. And of course, I'm also tapping into the broader literature that moves beyond military coercion to look at non-traditional forms of coercion, including the rich literature on raison coercion. And finally, maybe to argue against John a little bit, Mearsheimer a little bit, I would argue that linear power growth is import, but it's insufficient in explaining specific foreign policy behavior of rising power. And very finally, and I promise I'll stop right after this, if you are interested in policy implications, not that the U.S. government is interested in what I say, but here's two. So the first one would be, I would advocate for more of a quiet rebalancing strategy for the United States. What that means is do more, say less, which might reduce the media attention and exposure, while at the same time increasing China's potential geopolitical backlash. And second, I would argue that on the economic front, the United States would have a lot more targeted leverage by keeping China in the global production and supply chains and keeping China continuously vulnerable and dependent on key U.S. technologies. And thank you so much again for having me, and I look forward to any questions and comments that we
Hi, thank you very much, Ketian. Previous chairs of this seminar have started what I regard as the unfortunate norm of recognizing students over faculty. And so reluctantly, I will follow that pattern, gritting my teeth throughout it. But this puts the onus on the students to raise their hands. Otherwise, this norm is going to evaporate like smoke, as it should. So who'd like to ask the first question? I ask people raise their hand, they keep it up so I can keep a list here. Going once, please, Will.
Doctor, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it. Welcome to Notre Dame. I was wondering about, first you talked about sanctions and non-coercive power. Have you looked much into, there's a lot of arguments, at least from my perspective, from what I understand about the effectiveness of sanctions, especially for a geopolitical situation like China. You see the routes that have gone through, especially just with Ukraine, and how Russia's been able to redirect their economy in certain capacities. Is there any, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to read much of your work, but can you speak a little more about the effectiveness of sanctions, and has that determined when they use coercive power in a military versus non-military sense?
Yep.
should I end?
Yes, no.
And that's a great question. So first off, I should preface by saying that there are way more scholars who do really interesting work on exactly evaluating the effectiveness of Chinese economic statecraft. So Audrey Wan, for example, Will Norris, Jack Zhang, among others. So I don't claim credits for their arguments, but essentially I think the consensus among them is that Chinese sanctions tend to be, it really depends. And it really has to do with whether domestic actors were actually on board with the sanctions decisions that the Chinese government has already imposed. So on the decision-making front, decisions of sanctions or coercion tend to be centralized at the very high level. But at the same time, when it comes to implementation, sometimes local actors, especially economic actors, if they're not on board, especially if we trade with a country that China imposes sanctions on, then they might not actually implement the sanctions that the Chinese government wants. And I think Keisim Mura, our friend and colleague, has a recent international security article that exactly examines when Chinese provincial leaders will be on board with economic sanctions on Japan, which gets back to the question of does the expected effectiveness of sanctions have an impact on whether China will determine to use sanctions in the first place? I think the answer is partially yes, because the economic cost variable is kind of a interactive variable, right? In the sense that if China perceives a potential vulnerability with regards to the target, that is, it depends on the target for certain high-tech 18-meter pads, and oftentimes it might be less likely to use coercion. And in addition, in the case of Japan, I would say China learns over time. So it imposed a rare earth embargo on Japan in 2010, but it partially realized that it actually didn't really work with regard to Japan because China really depends on Japan for a high-tech 18-meter product. So when we take a look at the 2012 Senkaku Island dispute, when China used coercion, it almost exclusively utilized diplomatic sanctions and gray zone coercion, precisely because I think they realized that economic sanctions on Japan might not be as effective as they think it would be, precisely because of this concerns about economic cost. So, short answer, the effects of Chinese economic statecraft really varies based on domestic kind of actors. And in addition, I should also say that the effects of China's coercion in general will oftentimes be suboptimal because of the inherent tension in China's overall grand strategy. Because on one hand, China wants to maintain stable environment for economic development, which means that you want more BRI or sort of economic growth. But on the other hand, it wants to establish resolve to defend national security interests, which means coercion. And these two goals go 180 degrees. And they oftentimes result in an automatic suboptimal result, as opposed to sort of optimizing the effects of easy coercion of any kind.
Thank you.
Edward Nagler.
Thank you for a great talk. The question I had kind of about the conversation regarding policy implications was I thought about the U.S. decision to withdraw from the TPP in 2017. And I guess kind of thinking about the economic cost variable, which is marked as low past 2007 in your article. If the United States, were to stay in the TPP or try to renegotiate its way into a free trade agreement in the region, would that kind of raise the economic costs for China to use economic coercion because its target states would potentially be less dependent on China? So I guess the question I'd have is, if the U.S. were to have stayed in the TPP, would that reduce China's ability to use coercion?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess what you were asking is whether US joining or we're coming back or staying within the TPP will have an impact on China's economic relationship with ASEAN in general, and whether that will create more exit options for ASEAN. I would say, so first off, the economic cost variable, it does shift over time, but it also varies with regard to different target states. I would say China's economic cost with the United States has been lower than compared to the 1990s, but it's still pretty high compared to, for example, the entirety of ASEAN. But to your question, I don't think that the counterfactual being, even if the United States stays within the TPP, ASEAN countries, a lot of the ASEAN countries will still trade pretty significantly with China. So take the Philippines, for example. I don't think the U.S. remaining in the TPP will change the facts that Sino-Philippine trade constituted as a pretty significant amount of overall Philippine trade. And in fact, it's true that the United States left the TPP, but doesn't mean that the United States does not trade with ASEAN countries. And the Philippines, for example's top three trading partners actually include the United States, Japan, and China, outside of intra-ASEAN trade. So I don't think TPP being in or out of it has too much of an impact on economic stability. But I would say the TPP is more of like a signal of whether the United States is committed to the Southeast Asian region as perceived by ASEAN countries. I think that has more to do with potential geopolitical backlash, or how ASEAN perceives the U.S. commitment and result.
Great. Next on the list is Harrison Greenlee.
Yeah, hi. I found the argument valid, in particular the one when you state that the fear of geopolitical backlash will guide them towards non-military. But I guess in looking at the history, particularly in the case of the Philippines, doesn't show that hope's futile anyway. So in 2014, you have the enhanced cooperation agreement signed between the United States and the Philippines in response to even this non-military coercion. And later you have this again recently in the last few years. So I guess at what point does China just kind of give up that hope that regardless of what we're going to do, if it's even just any type of coercion, it's going to be met with balancing on behalf of the United States. So are we just going to abandon this pursuit anyway, and let's just go for if we're going to get balanced against anyway, let's just go for the military coercion?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's true that coercion of any kind will most likely generate some kind of response, or at least perceptual wise. But first off, I might push back a little bit about like how do we actually define balancing, and secondly, what will be like a less worse option for China? Because starting from the second point, I think China is really trying to reach a suboptimal result as opposed to optimizing the use of coercion. It does, I think, in a way, understand that using negative actions will generate some kind of reactions, but the China's concern is really more like, so we have, or we as in China, have the concern about establishing resolve and also creating a relatively stable environment, but using military coercion will generate an even bigger kind of backlash than compared to gray zone coercion. Of course, gray zone coercion does generate some kind of concerns, and goes back to the question about the effects and effectiveness of using coercion in the first place, but at least it will not lead to the worst case scenario, in which case the United States might be militarily directly involved. So I would say it's sort of a Goldilocks choice, right? It's in the middle. It's not optimizing on either end. And historically, though, I would say the geopolitical backlash cost for China to using coercion in the South China Sea was actually low for some period of time, especially in the 1990s, when you see the use of military coercion in that time period. And that had to do with, for example, the United States leaving the Subic Bay and completely. And you'll see in internal documents that Chinese analysts and government officials were saying the United States left a huge geopolitical vacuum that we can sort of take advantage of, and hence the use of military coercion a little bit more. But moving forward, I don't think, unless we have a new administration here that argues for more defense budget within ASEAN countries as opposed to more commitment, I don't see the geopolitical backlash going down anytime soon. But that again means that China can optimize. It can only just to sort of make a Goldilocks choice between to what extent it can use coercion to establish resolve and when to use coercion in the first place. But just one last point about balancing. I think individual ASEAN countries are reacting. The Philippines, for example, it certainly has already taken quite a bit of a side, especially post Duterte, more so in the Marcos administration. But the entirety of ASEAN itself is not united, I would say, yet against China. If you ask Vietnamese counterparts, so I've had conversations with Vietnamese diplomats based in DC, as well as Malaysian scholars, and they actually do not want to choose a side between China and the United States, and because they benefit a lot economically from China. And if you ask the Vietnamese diplomat, they were actually pretty angry about the Philippines' behavior over the second Thomas show. Their logic was precisely what China was arguing, that the Philippines was internationalizing and sensationalizing the South China Sea issue. So in a way, I would say you actually don't really see an overall counterbalancing sort of coalition in terms of the entirety of ASEAN.
Great, thank you. We'll hop into cyberspace. Natalie Morris asks, you made a point about keeping China in the global trade, production, and supply chain. How would this impact U.S. politicians who want to economically decouple from China as a point of preserving national security and bolster the U.S. economy? How can we balance both of these goals?
Right, great question. So for the politician, I think they'll be very angry at me. I presented sort of like a version of this work at State 2 years ago when decoupling, not de-risking, was still a theme, arguing the opposite, and they were not that happy about what I said. But I think my take on this is that there's a lot of discussions about decoupling based on national security interests, but I would also want to push us to think more about the unintended national security consequences of decoupling. So the two scenarios that I am worried about is the first one, as I think Will mentioned earlier, it's actually pretty difficult to impose sort of an overall embargo or ban, because for a lot of the times countries might be able to find imports through like third party, either illicit or legal markets, right? So like the Ukraine situation or sort of the economic sanctions on Russia would be an example. And one other example would be Malaysia. And part of the reason why China also went easy on Malaysia is that China actually imports way more oil from Malaysia than Malaysia could actually produce in 2023. And the reason being Malaysia imported oil from Iran, which tried to basically evade the sanctions regime placed on Iran. So Iranian oil went into China, cycling through Malaysia. So you could argue that for some of the semiconductors, that could potentially happen, which reduces the effectiveness of using such bans on national security purposes, right? So in that scenario, if China succeeds in sort of getting these products through illicit markets or legal markets, or if it's able to produce domestically, then we'll be seeing a China that's a lot less vulnerable on any other country economically. What that means is that the economic cost of using coercion will decrease drastically. We might be seeing a much more aggressive China. And the second scenario would be the ban is completely successful, which I don't think will be, but just assume that it's going to be successful, then China would not be able to develop its domestic sort of semiconductor or other high-tech sectors. And we might be seeing a China that's way more autarkic, going back to what would be a Maoist period. And if you remember history, the Maoist China is not the most peaceful country in the world, right? So we might be ending up in a two scenarios where China is either successful, that is no leverage on China anymore, or very unsuccessful, in which case that it has nothing less to lose. So either case would not be most optimal, I think, for U.S. national security. But if we're talking about using these bans for domestic U.S. economic competitiveness, that's a different kind of question. But I think we do really need to think about what is the end goal of adopting these bans, right? Is it economic competition for firms, or is it about national security? In which case, I think there are unintended.
Great, thank you. Alex Lin?
Good to see you. Thanks for coming out. So, can you go back to the slide where you show a graph where you say all the potential opportunities for coercion versus set against Chinese coercion? So my question for you is, how should I think about U.S. involvement kind of to your story as related to your argument about why and when coercion happens, right? In thinking about this question of why/when, you think about this in terms of reputation/result. And you talk about U.S. involvement some, but then largely over the what tool to use question, right? Geopolitical backlash variable. That's the only place you really mentioned U.S. involvement. And so in your talk, you mentioned this killing a chicken, scaring the monkey.
Yeah.
Right. I got that right. Logic. But I wonder if I can tell a different kind of story, also based on another Chinese thing, which is to deter the fox from inviting the tiger in, right, as you know. And the logic here is something like as follows, right? So as you know, in my book project, I look at 40 years of empathetic statements from China. And one of the reoccurring talking points to China is this idea of, look, the Philippines or any other claimant, please do not multilateralize. This is a bilateral dispute. Don't actively invite the U.S. into the region, thereby creating potential for the U.S. to engage in intervention in the region, right? And so there is this constant fear for both internationalizing the dispute, but also U.S. military intervention in the region. Maybe not full-scale intervention, but fun ops, etc., right? And so there's this sort of logic where you're trying to deter the fox, the smaller state, Philippines, from actively inviting the tigers into the region, because that changes the balance of power. All of a sudden, you're not really dealing with a small adversary, but really the small adversary plus the bigger adversary, in fact, supporting that small adversary, right? So there's this preemptive logic where you coerce the Philippines in hopes that it'll get the Philippines to back down before the U.S. steps in, because once the Philippines backs down, the U.S. really loses that justification to intervene, right, or at least get more involved. You can imagine a different status story, which is that, okay, well, I'm trying to signal to the U.S. that the Philippines stop trying to say this is really my backyard, stay off, right? So the signaling is really towards preventing U.S. intervening in the South China Sea. So if you, for example, look at this data set, one of the really interesting things that I've done in grad school was mapping racial who
Yeah.
had a data set on US funds throughout this entire time, right? And so one of the things that you will notice if you map her data onto yours, that also in 2007, US freedom of navigation's operations started to intensify during that same time. And so how should I think about this in terms of cause and effect? Which comes first? How does US play into Chinese coercion?
Right. That's an interesting question. I guess two things here first. I do think that the U.S. question or sort of U.S. factor features prominently in, for example, the Taiwan question. So anything about like the policy visit, for example, that's definitely sending a signal to the United States as well. So I think the potential monkeys include the United States. When it comes to the South China Sea, I think the logic of using coercion to, I guess, compel a country to back down or be closer to China as opposed to aligning closer to the United States seems interesting in the sense that if we assume that the balance of threats logic is at play, then by using more coercion of any kind, wouldn't it drive the Philippines even closer to the United States as opposed to compelling the Philippines much closer to China by using coercion, which is why I think the FunUp story, for example, can still be explained by increasing or continuous geopolitical backlash on the part of the United States, which does not mean that I do think that you're right in the sense that China is also trying to maybe send a signal to the United States, but I would say that might be more of a second order kind of signal as opposed to direct signals with regard to these disputes within the South China Sea. I think one of the reason I think the South China Sea issue is a little bit different from Taiwan is that a lot of these incidents are very local. They're just like about fishing incidents or incidents where foreign companies explore or extract oil in a region, and those incidents do not necessarily involve the United States per se. And in addition, it's not so much that China does not coerce Malaysia at all. It does use coercion of Malaysia from time to time, and also another country that I didn't mention here is Vietnam. So China actually coerced Vietnam somewhat in the middle, maybe closer to like the level of the Philippines. I don't think China thinks that Vietnam is going within the U.S. aligned circle like anytime soon. But we're still seeing sort of like a similar trend of coercing Vietnam and the Philippines way more than Malaysia. So that's why I think there is a second order kind of signal here, but it might not be the most salient reason for when and why China uses coercion. But I think the point about the FunUp data set, it's a very much a valid point.
Great, thanks. Next on the list is breaking the glass floor for faculty participation.
People then can talk these days?
Yeah, Professor Lindley.
Thank you so much. I want to go back to Ryan's point about effectiveness and why it's not really part of your model. So you have this utility maximizing model, and it seems like a key factor in assessing utility would be effectiveness. Is it going to work or not? So you work that in a little bit with your backlash. That's the biggest cost that could be paid is the backlash. What about the cost of failure of what you're trying to get resolved from? So if the Philippines successfully resists, people in the neighborhood say, wait, the Philippines successfully resists, or the Philippines cave. And that would seem to me to be a huge part of the Chinese equation, is to have something about effectiveness. Now, one of your ways out is you could be arguing that resolve is established whether or not you succeed or fail, right? It's the effort. If it's a big, strong effort, the whole neighborhood will know, and they won't want to suffer, even if the Philippines survived it. You won't want to suffer a similar fate. But I don't hear you making that argument. I think you moved away from effectiveness with the one sentence that's talking about the lit review, saying most people study effectiveness. And your claim to fame is you're not, so you didn't. And I think you're paying the price in terms of the completeness of your model. So I just wanted to push you a little bit on that.
Right. Thank you. And actually, I think you actually answered the question because the article version was like, I don't know, 5 years ago. So in the book, the theoretical chapter of the book, I actually talk about sort of why there isn't why there are circumstances where there isn't really an interaction, or why a child won't be concerned about potential failures of coercion. So I was using the exact same logic that you laid out, which can, I think, manifest itself in both foreign policy and also domestic politics. So as in but, for example, my colleague has a really interesting article that argues that the United States engages in the Iraq War for performative purposes, so just to basically scare the other monkeys. And similarly, if we look at domestic Chinese politics, I think Isa Dean, a comparativist of Chinese environmental politics, makes the argument that China oftentimes uses environmental policies for performative purposes, and again, just to show to the citizens that is actually doing something. So the logic here, I think, is actually quite similar in the sense that China's logic is that as long as we do it, and other states are observing, at least China using sanctions or gray zone coercion or other kinds of observable actions, and the actions themselves will have a performative purpose, in which case that other states might be deterred from doing similar things, say, that the Philippines did in the future. And especially, I think the reason here is that other states do not necessarily have the exact same stakes that the Philippines has on the South China Sea, so they might not necessarily track the development of events in the South China Sea as closely as the Philippines does. So they might only observe, for example, the incidents and then media reports of Chinese sanctions or coercion. So the very act of scaring the chicken might have a chilling effect on the other targets. So I have an article that's forthcoming with Texas National Security Review that sort of makes this exact argument, which is that in the data set that I've collected about Chinese economic sanctions from 1990 to the present, 87% of Chinese economic sanctions adopted this model of just doing. Right? China just enacted sanctions. It did not go through the threatening stage, which oftentimes is competent with, so for example, U.S. sanctions, but China just went straight ahead. And the logic, part of it has to do with its physical action sent a potentially stronger signals of resolve to the other targets who are potentially observing kind of behavior or fill up.
Great. Kirby Davis? Sorry, Gene.
I was already sort of noodling this question, but I think you've just driven a truck through your theory, right? Like you smashed your theory. And so to me, resolve
Has to be driving an elephant. We're using the
Okay. You
the
bring it
animal metaphor.
in, you stampeded it.
Yes, the elephant, water buffalo.
Yeah. Anyway, whatever it is. So to me, resolve is about demonstrating your willingness to pay costs over an issue, right? That's the definition of resolve. It's how much cost am I willing to pay? If I'm highly resolved, I'm willing to pay on my costs. And I already thought there was a problem in the first two steps of your theory because they decide they need to show resolve or develop resolve.
Can you
And
go
then
to
the
that?
second step of your theory is they weigh the economic cost. And if the economic cost is high, they don't do it. But the whole point of resolve is to show that you're willing to pay a high cost. And so how do you develop resolve by only paying low costs? And now you've made it worse in your answer to Dan, because you say, oh, it's all performative. It doesn't matter whether it works. It's all just showing that I'm willing to bleed, willing to pay high costs. I'm just doing it. I'm paying my costs, and I'm showing I really care about this issue. But then your second variable just falls apart, right? Because you should be most interested in just doing it in cases of high cost, not cases of low cost. If the goal of just doing it is to show you're willing to pay cost.
Yeah. So two two things here. I agree that in cases of very high stakes, China will be willing to do anything despite the high economic cost. So that's where the issue of importance comes into play. So I would make the argument that we are observing these sort of more sub-optimizing behavior in the South China Sea precisely because those issues are issues that are negotiable and China has room for maneuver. Whereas when it comes to Taiwan, I've had cases in the Taiwan chapter where China was facing high need to establish resolve, but also high economic cost in the 1990s over the Taiwan Strait, for example, and it still used military coercion nevertheless. So that I think it's in a way more of the cases that you were talking about. But I think in the case of maritime disputes in the South and East China Seas, the stakes are simply not high enough for China to engage in those potentially very economically damaging kind of coercive action. So the second part of, I guess, my response is that we might differ on the starting point with regard to the assumptions of how states operate. I think your assumption would be more about the goal would be just maximizing resolve. But my argument, especially for rising powers, would be rising powers always have trade-offs. And the trade-off is between security and the economic concerns. And especially for issues that are not core interests, they're willing to take a more suboptimal kind of outcome, which is that if the economic cost is sufficiently high, they'll resort to coercion, especially despite the high need to establish results. So right around the same time of China using coercion militarily over Taiwan in the Taiwan Strait, 1995 and 1996, China had the exact same sort of scenario with regard to Japan all over the Pacific balance. 1996 and 1997, I need to establish resolve at high economic cost, but China ended up not using coercion, I think because of the differential issue importance here. So I don't disagree with you on certain issue areas of highest interest or core interest, but I think in other issue areas, China is in a rising power and it has an economic trade-off, and it will not be able to use coercion anytime or anywhere that it wants. In an ideal world, the best kind of coercive, signaling would be to show resolve despite the high economic cost. But China is not in an ideal world. It's in a world where there's resource restraint. So I don't think that. So I'm more of a trade-off kind of a model in terms of how states think about its foreign policy, especially rising powers.
Okay, Kirby, you're next.
Yeah, so I have two questions. First question, do you include island building efforts in it, which are militarized in their response in your data set? And second, does China see the changing military balance, its investments in like naval forces, as influencing this issue at all? Like, so do those longer term investments in military forces, do they see those as positively affecting these disputes despite them not having necessarily an immediate military response to the issue?
Those are good questions, and the first one is that the simple answer is that it wasn't a dissertation, but I took it off partially because it's too long, and secondly, it's actually a slightly different kind of behavior than these direct compellent actions. So in a separate article in the Journal of Strategic Studies, I do examine China's decision-making rationale with regard to land reclamation, especially in between 2014 and 2015 or so. I would call it more of like a deterrent kind of effort. And in addition, the crucial motivation for China to engage in land reclamation or land reclamation would be mostly about logistics, both on the economic front, but more importantly on the military front, because the Chinese Navy needs those logistical resupply bases, essentially. So that's most on the island building question. And in terms of military development, I think it's very much relevant. The Chinese Navy is not directly involved in these compellent actions. especially post 2007. But that does not mean that they're not there. So when I was like interviewing former Chinese officials and those in the Navy, they would say, for example, when it comes to Vietnam or any other incidents in the South China Sea, you'll see what you'll see is a model of a concentric circles, where the Chinese Coast Guards and the maritime surveillance ships, they were at the forefront of the compelling action. But over the horizon, you're going to see Chinese naval ships sort of more so lurking in the background, serving more or less as like a potential deterrent kind of effect. And if you ask Southeast Asian counterparts, for example, they'll say that to a certain extent, they still fear China's military development in the South China Sea. So I would say the military buildup in the South China Sea is more so of a deterrent kind of purpose from deterring other countries from escalating the tension either further.
Great. Jingli?
Yeah, hi, Dr. Zhang. Thank you. Amazing talk, especially because you are on very little sleep because your flight was delayed. My question potentially goes back to the capability versus resolve conversation. I'm curious how you think of the role of economic crisis, because when you look at the figure that Alex had a question on, 2001, 2008, and potentially 2022, coercion is really low. So that means the Chinese state had enormous economic costs to conduct these coercions because they would have been busy dealing with the economic crisis.
Right, that's an interesting so for 2021, and I absolutely understand more so like COVID period. So 2001, you're thinking about entering into the WTO, or
Or just the dot-com buzz originating from the U.S. and spreading to the world.
Right. So the 2001, 2002, 2006 or so, like this little dip here, I think it very much has to do with economic cost, but a little bit different from the one that you were describing, especially with regard to Southeast Asia, per se ASEAN. So interestingly, in that period of time, the economic cost of using coercion on ASEAN was relatively high. Part of the reason has to do with China's entry into the WTO, which would be potentially threatening to other ASEAN countries, because other ASEAN countries will view China as a potential competitor in terms of exporting to, say, OECD countries. So around that time, you'll find Chinese government documents, including those from, I think, Jerome Ji, etc., the Chinese premier, in which they were exceedingly concerned about appeasing Southeast Asian countries in terms of China's entry into the WTO, trying to, in a way, reassure that Southeast Asian countries will not be affected if China entered the WTO. And another layer to this period is that China was trying to expand its trade relationship by establishing free trade zones, FTZs, and other OECD countries, developed countries, that were not willing to negotiate with China at the time over an FTZ, and ASEAN was the only region that was willing to negotiate with China on a FTZ. And in the Hartian sense, China really doesn't have any exit options outside of ASEAN. So in that short period of time, I would say the economic cost for coercing any country, the speeds in the South China Sea would be high. And post 2000, I think 8 or 9 or so, the free trade zone between China and ASEAN became mature enough such that it won't even go away. And as a result, China's exports to ASEAN, especially in terms of high-end machineries, increased dramatically, increasing, interestingly and ironically, China's leverage economically on ASEAN. And in terms of 2021, or more so in the current period, so the data set didn't have the last 3 years, but I would say if we think that, but I would say the economic crisis or economic slowdown, if it will, has more to do with regard to or vis-a-vis the United States, not so much with regard to ASEAN. And especially if you look at this pattern that I don't have here, in the last 2 years or so, there's a little bit of a an uptick in terms of coercion in the South China Sea again, and partially it was a result of the media attention and exposure in the South China Sea, especially more so in terms of the Philippines, and that use of coercion or the frequency, we're actually seeing a slight uptick despite the overall Chinese economic slowdown. So that's why I think the economic cost variable is not just a linear variable that applies to all countries around the world. It varies with regard to different targets and in different time periods. But I think the economic cost, or mentioning economic cost, is very is definitely relevant for the story here.
Thanks. Seeing no other hands, I'm going to recognize myself. I'm going to go back to the opening quiz that you gave us. I sort of see an interesting pattern there that I'm having trouble reconciling with your model. I call the pattern petting the weasel and choking the chipmunk. The weasel being Malaysia, which is getting filthy rich, violating the 9-dash line. And the chipmunk is the Philippines, which is not doing the same thing. If you could go back to your decision tree.
Yeah.
So, both in the opening sort of vignette, but then at a number of points in your talk, the response of the other actor becomes very important. In fact, in the big data you showed, it's actually the Philippines who are pushing the Scarborough shoals issue first, and China is in a way reactive. So the behavior of other actors turns out to be really important in the narrative, but I don't exactly see how it fits in the model. Can you show me what I'm missing, or help me understand, how we or how you're sort of theorizing that in terms of Chinese decision making?
So by behavior of others, so my reading of your question, Mike, is that you're seeing just the Philippines, and is that really actions of anybody else, say Vietnam or Malaysia or Brunei?
No. Malaysia is they're sucking oil out of the South China Sea, but they're also doing it very low key. So they're doing two things. That's why they're the weasel, and they seem to be getting a positive reaction from the Chinese, whereas the Philippines are actually not doing that much in terms, apparently, of the exploitation of oil resources, but they have the temerity to raise issues of sovereignty, and they're getting, relatively speaking, dealt with more harshly.
Right.
So the difference is between Malaysian behavior and Philippine behavior.
Right. So I think that there are two things here, and the first one is that what concerns like Chinese government analysts and officials most is the potential for sort of like future new oil fields in the South China Sea or other kinds of development. So they, in a way, they're quite pragmatic. They think that a lot of the oil fields that Malaysia developed really started going way back to like the 1920s, 1930s, etc. They're sort of considering it as a done deal. There's nothing much that China can do. First off, to compel them to back out from the South China Sea. There's another layer that I'm going to talk about soon. But so the concern from the Philippines, therefore, became very much about the future potentials of signing contracts or investing additional foreign companies into the region. And those oil and gas exploration, even though they're not extracting oil per se, the very act of those extracting activities will demonstrate sovereignty claims on those rocks. So on the part of, for example, Vietnam or the Philippines, if anything, we're seeing similar patterns on Vietnam as well. I think, I can't remember if the map actually shows Vietnamese oil fields, but in like intro meeting in a Chinese government think tank I was able to participate, one of the government analysts kind of just slipped by saying that Vietnam does not even have any operating oil fields within the 9-dash line. And this person literally said that, but the institute had just caught this person because I was there. But it does show that Vietnam was having a similar kind of dynamic here. So the concern about China, I think, is more about future potential for oil fields. We're signing additional contracts, which in turn will increase the claim strength or the sovereignty claims that other countries, Vietnam and the Philippines, have on the South China Sea. And another additional layer to this is, I would say, more so about the economic cost, in the sense that China actually does benefit from importing oil and liquefied natural gas, LNG, from Malaysia. And in addition, the Iran story that I talked about, like Malaysia was pretty critical in this sort of like third party kind of market in China's energy sector. So if we compare the level of need to establish resolve, I would put Malaysia meaning more so in the intermediary category, even though in the book I don't have, theory does not have an intermediate category, but I think it's lower, at least comparatively, than compared to Vietnam and the Philippines. And adding on to this economic story, that's why I think Malaysia has more of like a preferential treatment from China.
Great. Well, we're actually right at 5:59. It's appropriate that you would have the last word. Other than me inviting the audience to join me in thanking Ketian Zhang for we have the last NDISC seminar before spring break on Tuesday, March 5th, I believe. Professor Daniel Nexon of Georgetown University. So look forward to seeing all of you then. And by the way, John Mearsheimer was right before you. So if you felt the ghost in him in the room, that's what it was from. Thank you very much.